Mehran. È l'autore di un bestseller che The New Geography of Innovation, che va a indagare come cambiano i pesi dei luoghi dove si genera innovazione. Una delle tesi: il centro dell'innovazione, la culla dell'innovazione non è più la Silicon Valley, ma ci spiegherà perché.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. Good morning, and thank you so much for having me on this lovely morning in Rome. We are here today to talk about, just one second, I don't have a clicker. Can I have a clicker for the presentation? Can I have the clicker? Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Abbiamo il clicker, ovviamente, abbiamo le cuffie e abbiamo anche l'onore di avere in sala traduzione la traduttrice e il team che traducono gli incontri dei presidenti, delle regine e dei re. Quindi l'invito è a mettere le cuffie e questo agevolerà la comprensione della presentazione. Prego.
Great. Hi, so again, good morning. So we are here to talk about the geopolitical network, and really the theme of the conference is fragmentation of the internet. And as many of you would know very well, that fragmentation is being driven primarily by a competition among countries in technology. But you would also know that competition in technologies is not really limited just to the internet. And so in order to put the conversations that you're going to have for the rest of the day in the proper, broader context, I'm going to set things up right now to give you maybe an overview of what this competition among countries for frontier technologies really looks like, and perhaps where Europe lies in this competition. And it's a topic that I've been thinking about for more than a decade. And back in 2018, there was a book that came out by Alan Greenspan, who was the former chairman of the Federal Reserve in the US. And the book was really about why is it that the US stands head and shoulders above its European and Asian peers when it comes to everything from economic performance to technological performance. And the conclusion of that book was somewhat downcast, where they noted that the US is becoming indistinguishable from other mature, slow-growth economies, such as Europe and Japan, in its handling of creative destruction. And I read that book, and the natural question that comes up when you read something like that is, if the US is in decline when it comes to new technologies, then who is in ascendance? And what does that map really look like? And that's a question that I spent 5 years researching for my book. And before I maybe jump into the wider findings, I'd like to maybe start with 2 examples that I think really portray in vivid terms what's happening in the world today. The first example is from AI research. What you have in front of you is a paper called Deep Residual Learnings for Image Recognition, otherwise known as ResNet. The ResNet paper came out of a lab in Beijing. Within about a decade, this paper has become the most cited paper in artificial intelligence. It is also the most cited paper in computer science. It is, in fact, the most cited paper in all of science, physics, chemistry, math, everything combined, published in the 21st century. And the fact that the world's most important paper right now comes from a lab in Beijing ought to challenge our preconceived notions about everything that we tend to hear about China, about things like, they're only good at copycat innovation, or they're only good at innovation at the level of products and services. This is basic scientific research in a frontier area in which they're punching at the highest level globally. The authors of the ResNet paper, prior to publishing their landmark paper, had all gotten their undergraduate, graduate, and PhD degrees in China. None of them had either worked or studied in China prior to publishing their landmark papers. They have all won other major awards and recognitions. And this is not an isolated incident. This graph is from The Economist, and it came out just 2 weeks ago. And it shows that in NeurIPS, which is the most prestigious international conference in artificial intelligence, the highest number of papers that were accepted came from China. At least one of the co-authors was Chinese, and this was the first time that China actually ranked ahead of the US when it comes to the highest number of papers that came from authors based in a certain country. And what you have in front of you are the 15 institutions globally, both private and public sector, which contribute the most number of highly cited academic papers in artificial intelligence. 10 out of these 10 institutions are Asian. 9 out of these 10 are Chinese. So that's just to sort of give you a sense of what's happening on the research side. Maybe let's also have a look at what's happening on the industry side as well. And I'd maybe like to start with the battery industry, which is an area in which Europe has been making a lot of efforts recently. If you look at the top 10 players in the battery industry, regionally, there's perhaps no other industry that is as skewed. All 10 of the world's major battery manufacturers are Asian, mostly Chinese, but also Korean and Japanese as well. It's a $150 billion industry that is almost entirely Asian, but it's not as if Europe hasn't tried. For anyone in this room who follows the European tech sector closely, Northvolt would be a name that would be very familiar to you. This was a Swedish company that came up in 2016 in the battery industry. It was at one point the highest funded European startup. It was also at one point the most valuable company to come out of Europe as well, valued at over $10 billion. It was backed by just about every major investor on the continent, everything from Goldman Sachs to the European Infrastructure Investment Bank. And the importance of Northvolt really was that if you look at the past 50 years, the automotive industry, cars, has been perhaps the most strategic industry in Europe, with countries like Germany, with Mercedes and Audi, for instance, with countries like Italy. I don't need to explain to you how important the automotive industry has been to Italy in the past 50 years. And so the play over here really was for Europe to position itself to own a future of the car. And it did not work out very well. Earlier last year, Northvolt, which was at one point the most valuable new startup in Europe, filed for bankruptcy. It could not really compete with the Asian players very effectively. And the reason was very simple. It was operating on top of what was a 7 layers deep Chinese supply chain. If your battery pack, cell manufacturing, and all your materials are coming from one region, you can't really enter only at the manufacturing layer and try and compete globally over there. And Northvolt is not really the exception. It's the rule for what has happened in the battery industry in Europe more broadly. If you look at British Volt, which came up in the UK, it also went bankrupt. Italvolt has stalled for many years now. And similar sort of stories from France, Germany, and elsewhere as well. So it's one industry in which Europe has tried to compete very hard, but has found it very hard to get a toehold against these Asian players. And the interesting thing about the lithium-ion batteries is that it's not an Asian invention. Much of the early work that went into lithium-ion batteries happened in Europe. This is an invention that happened at Oxford University. And John Goodenough is the person who did the early research in lithium-ion batteries. He won a Nobel Prize for it. And there was an invention that happened in Europe, but it was not able to then capture the economic value that came from that invention. And that leads me to what is my main thesis for this presentation, which is that the country that invents is not necessarily the country that also monetizes the market as well. And we'll come back to this idea multiple times in this conversation. And so in recent years, we have seen a lot of conversation around the US being in decline. This is an article that was written by the president of MIT, Raphael Reif. It came out in Foreign Affairs. The title speaks for itself. America is losing the innovation race. Why the future of science might be Chinese. In the New York Times recently, another headline, I went to China to see progress in AI. We can't beat it. Another one in the New York Times, I just returned from China, we are not winning. And any given week, you can see maybe 5 or 6 headlines that look exactly like this. And I'd like to maybe push back against this popular consensus that exists in the media today about how the US is maybe in decline. And this is something that I talk about in detail in the book, but if you look at the most valuable companies in AI today, we are actually seeing more centralization rather than more democratization. What you have in front of you is the total share of market value globally when it comes to AI companies. And the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, is leaving everyone behind. If you look at companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, NVIDIA, all of them now worth over $1 trillion, some of them worth multiples of $1 trillion. You can't really look at all of that and say that the US is losing in AI or in frontier technologies. What we are seeing is more centralization, not less. And you can also see that in the number of AI companies produced in the US versus the rest of the world. The US is still leading, especially in relation to Europe, but also in relation to China as well. And recently, Paul Graham, who founded Y Combinator, perhaps the best known startup incubator in the world, made a note that it's striking how concentrated the AI revolution is. Even though starting out, startups had spread worldwide in the last couple of decades, this wave of tech has concentrated more in the Bay Area. So, and you can see that in the US as well. The trend is towards more concentration, not less. If you look at the amount of money that was invested in AI last year in California, for instance, it was about $200 billion, which was 10 times more than the second on that list, which is Colorado, and 20 times more than New York, which is third on that list. So the world is not, for everything that we hear about new technologies creating more economic democratization, more leveling of the playing field, the world is flat, that book came out something like 20 years ago, that is not happening. We're seeing more economic concentration, not less. And you can see that the US is still leading when it comes to measures of economic performance, measures of technological performance, when you look at the leaderboards for the top AI models in the world. So this is a study conducted by Stanford. It ranks the most capable AI models in the world. You can see that Anthropic, XAI, Google are still at the top. And then Chinese models like DeepSeek and Alibaba come a little bit after that. And, the important thing is not that the US is ahead. The important thing is how much money it has had to spend in order to get that marginal advantage. So the US is vastly outspending the rest of the world when it comes to AI. But at the same time, the advantage that it has is only very marginal. For every additional dollar that it might invest in AI, it's not getting an additional dollar back. It's maybe getting a cent or 10 cents back. And you can see that in the fact that for about spending 23 times more than China, for the leading leaderboards, there's only about a 2.7% advantage that the US enjoys right now when it comes to the performance of their frontier models. And Stanford pointed out recently that with capability no longer being a key differentiator, the competitive pressure is moving towards cost, reliability, and real-world usefulness. What does that mean in practice? I'd like to frame what's happening between the US and China right now in terms of a frontier versus deployment dynamic, where even if one country might lead in developing more cutting-edge AI, the other country is winning the market. And we can see that in a number of other technologies as well. If you look at the most consequential technologies that we talk about today, EVs, 5G, mobile payments, industrial robots, none of them were invented in China. But for all of them, the scale of adoption in China today outpaces the rest of the world combined. And this is something that the Chinese AI ecosystem is very aware of. The person in front of you perhaps would be very familiar to many people in this room. This is Kai-Fu Lee, maybe the most consequential AI leader in China today. I had a chance to interview him recently, and he said that even if we live in a world today where some of the most important advances in technology are still coming from the US, the important thing is that once that technology is written up and available on the internet or in papers, Chinese companies are more likely to run away with this engineering excellence. In other words, America is very good at building ladders. China is better at climbing them. And this goes back to what we talked about in the lithium-ion batteries, which is the fact that it was invented in Europe did not really have any impact on the companies that eventually won that race. In other words, the country that invents is not necessarily the country that wins the market. And so when we talk about what the future of AI might look like, that's the next big platform shift. In order to think about who's going to win, what would the market look like, maybe it's useful to look at the last major platform shift, which was smartphones. So the world's first smartphone was released in 2007. An invention in Silicon Valley. 20 years later, it might be useful to look at what does the market share for smartphones look like today. And it looks something like this. Even though smartphones were an American invention, today only about 1 in 5 smartphones that is sold globally was manufactured in the US. Not manufactured, was designed in the US. The other 4 out of 5 are all Asian players. There's Samsung, which is South Korean, but the rest are almost all Chinese. And if you look specifically at emerging markets, over there, the Chinese lead is even bigger. If you look at the smartphone share, for instance, in Africa, only 1% belongs to American companies. Most of it, almost all of it, belongs to Chinese players, with Transsion, a company that most of you would never have even heard about, having about half of the entire market for smartphones to itself in all of Africa. So the question is, could the same thing happen for AI as well, where even though this is something that is developed in the US, the market is captured by another region altogether? And the point that I'd like to highlight is that this is not something that is limited only to smartphones, only to lithium-ion batteries. Electric cars would be another good example. So famously, the first electric cars came out of the US. Tesla was the early pioneer. But what does the electric car market share today really look like? It looks something like this, where Tesla is the second most popular EV brand in the world. The first one's BYD. But in the top 10, it's primarily Asian players. There's only 3 Western players, Volkswagen, BMW, and Tesla. And many of these names you wouldn't even be familiar with, like Geely, for instance, Wuling, Leap Motor, et cetera. And why this is important for people in this room is that this is not just about having market share. This is also about, once the infrastructure on which your EV industry is built, that ecosystem belongs to one country or one region, it becomes very hard for people outside of that industry to break into that ecosystem. If standards are being defined by Chinese players, if interoperability is being defined by Chinese players, then are European players able to compete on that platform? Are Latin American players able to compete on that platform? And this has implications, for instance, for the internet as well. If the infrastructure for the internet in much of the emerging world is defined by Asian players, then can European players break into that ecosystem 5 years or 10 years down the line? There's massive ecosystem advantage that comes into play, which we are already seeing in the EV market, for instance, which if the software in your car was designed by Chinese firms, then the further apps that are developed in the US might not be compatible with that base layer of software. And before I sort of conclude, I wanted to talk a little bit about what is at stake here and where does Europe sort of lie in this conversation. If you look at the past 50-odd years and the major platform shifts that happened, it's been one country consistently, one after another, that has won each major wave. Desktops, operating systems, internet, e-commerce. And it's only with AI that we have opened up the field to talk about whether it's going to be China or the US. But it's not as if there are other regions which are very important in this specific conversation. And what has been the cumulative consequence of the US winning each platform shift? What you have in front of you is the combined market cap of just the 10 most important tech companies in the US. This combined market cap is now about $27 trillion. When numbers get very, very big, it's very hard for people to maybe wrap their head around them. So for the sake of comparison, I'm putting that number against the GDPs of the 10 largest, economically most significant countries in the world. Just the 10 largest American tech companies are now collectively worth than the entire GDP of every single country in the world except the US itself. And that is the consequence of them winning one platform shift after another. And if you look at the US versus China head-to-head for the past 30 years, you can see that in 1990, the US was responsible for about a quarter of the global GDP. Today, it's still responsible for about a quarter of the global GDP. Meanwhile, China, which used to be responsible for 1.9% of global GDP, has now multiplied tenfold to 19% of global GDP. My main point here is that China is growing, and it's growing fast, but not at the expense of the US, which is holding steady. It's expanding at the expense of other rich world economies, like those in Europe. And we can see that in the numbers. From 1980 onwards, the US percentage share of GDP against other G7 nations, like Italy, for instance, has been on its way up both in nominal and in real terms as well. So the question about who's winning US versus China is a fundamentally misrepresented question. The question is more, is Europe winning or not? And the answer to that is no. There was a recent piece that came out in the Wall Street Journal only about 3 weeks ago, which was very provocative, and I think it's important to maybe take a second to pause on this headline. What happens when Europeans find out how poor they are? And it highlighted facts such as the average income in France is half that of the average income in the US. Other facts such as if you take London out of the UK, the rest of the UK in per capita terms is poorer than every single state in the US. And why does that happen? Why has that state of affairs happened? And this is maybe the most important slide in this entire presentation. This is the percentage share of papers accepted to NeurIPS, which is the most important AI conference in the world. Half is Chinese, 40% is American, and over here, green is Europe. And this is not even political Europe. There's Switzerland, there's the UK, which are not in the EU. Political Europe is contributing only about 1% of frontier papers in AI today. And so this is the main reason why the economic performance that needs to happen 2 levels down is something that we're not seeing. I'm out of time right now. I want to go into some other examples. But I wanted you to maybe sort of reflect on this quote that was said to me by a very important European policymaker, that it's not about values, it's about power. And it's not about choosing sides between the US and China. Europe needs to show up to this competition as well. And I'd just like to conclude with this slide of what current competition in AI looks like based on the Tortoise Global AI Index, which is worth sort of reflecting on for a second.
Grazie.
Thank you.
Grazie Mehran Gul. Per questa cavalcata ci ha detto 2 cose fondamentalmente. È definitivamente partita la corsa all'oro dell'AI e non basta inventare, bisogna produrre. E c'è qualcuno che è molto bravo a produrre.